First up today is Chris Kraft, an educator, researcher, and consultant in the Midlands of South Carolina at the University of South Carolina. You could find him online at christophercraft.com or on Twitter at crafty184. Hello, Chris. Welcome. And let's start off by just having you talk a little bit about yourself, what you do, your areas of education and research, and what you really think is important that our viewers need to hear.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. Again, I'm Chris Kraft. You can find out more about me at christophercraft.com. As Ted said, I teach kids Spanish and Latin at Crossroads Middle School in Columbia, South Carolina. We have just over 1,000 sixth graders. We are an entirely sixth grade school, and about 80% of our students are divided into single gender teams. So they travel almost exclusively with members of the same gender. I love my job. Been teaching there for 5 years. I have a bachelor's in Spanish, hence the teaching of Spanish. I have a master's in educational technology, both from USC, and I'm just about finished with my PhD, also from USC. My PhD is in educational psychology and research. My research interests are in medical and healthcare simulations and instructional design methodologies.
Chris, single-gender education is something that South Carolina is actually one of the leaders in nationally. Have you noticed any differences in technology, in the use of technology in single-gender groupings?
I would argue that it's dependent upon the teacher. Now, I actually don't teach single-gender because kids are only in single-gender classes for their 4 core content classes. Exploratory, lunch, recess, and hall time are all mixed. So my classes, Spanish, Latin, and I also have a technology class as well, are all co-ed. Anecdotally, the teachers argue that the use of technology it can be slightly different. Girls have the tendency to want to work individually more often, whereas guys want to work in groups. Of course, it's classroom management and discipline can be different among the genders, but again, I can't really speak to that because I don't teach that.
Would you talk a few minutes about your dissertation topic and a little bit more about why you went to that area?
So years ago, before I finished my bachelor's, I was a paramedic for Richland County Emergency Services. We're one of the highest 911 call answering services in the state of South Carolina. So I dealt with a lot of trauma, met a lot of folks at Richland Memorial Hospital, which is the level 1 trauma center. Well, as I was going through my master's in EdTech, they sent out a job opening for a simulation specialist at the Palmetto Health Simulation Center. Well, I didn't need a job, but I was intrigued by the notion of healthcare simulations. So I went and toured the center. It turns out to be run by the chief of the emergency medicine residency, whom I know because he's also an attending physician in the Palmetto Health Trauma Center ER. So we got to having a conversation. I began reading everything I could find. There's a simulation and healthcare journal. So I began reading everything I could find on simulations in healthcare. And I was already interested in instructional design. And I thought, well, education in terms of funding writ large is in quite it's very tumultuous at the moment. But healthcare is not quite that way. Medical education always has money.
Yep.
So in terms of technological innovation, simulations is kind of where it's at. But we don't know yet, and by we I mean the larger body of literature, we don't know the best way to teach, learn, and assess in these simulated environments with high-fidelity mannequins. These mannequins can breathe like you and I can. The eyes function much like ours do. They speak much like you and I do. And they can be programmed to capture all level of metrics in the midst of a simulation. So we don't know how best to utilize these new technologies for teaching and learning. So I decided that that would be a wise area in which to invest my dissertation time, because even if I don't go into a career in healthcare simulation, my instructional design knowledge can be leveraged towards any one of a number of different areas.
Well, and that's certainly an area that we've been looking at, too, in the professional development of the medical field. Speaking of professional development, I wanted to talk a little more about your experience as a Google-certified teacher, smart, exemplary educator. You recently received an award this last year, didn't you?
I've received a handful of fairly notable awards inside of the last couple of years. Over the summer, I was awarded by ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education. I was awarded the Emerging Leader Award, which recognizes educators under 35 that are, well, emerging leaders. There were 5 of us selected across the nation. I've received the Making It Happen Award, which is making IT happen. And I was here in South Carolina. The South Carolina Association of Educational Technology awarded me the Technology Innovative Program Award in 2007. So some noteworthy stuff. I am a Google certified teacher, as you said. I was thrilled to attend the Google Teacher Academy in Washington, D.C. in December of '09.
Where's technology going in the future when it comes to maximizing the potential of students and classrooms, teachers? Give us your future wrap.
So that's difficult to do because it's in real upheaval at the moment, but I would say that we're heading towards the cloud. So 5 years ago, if you would have asked me that, I would have said that we were probably approaching a bit of a plateau with hardware processing power and memory capacities in desktop machines and so on. So then came the netbook revolution, but of course that only was able to work because of the parallel increases in cloud computing. I think, having been through the Google Teacher Academy and amongst a host of other things, in fact, Bill Gates just a couple of days ago said that inside of 5 years, no one will need to go to college because the web will be the best learning tool. I'm not certain that I agree with that, but I see what he's saying in that the resources that are offered, Khan Academy, MIT OpenCourseWare, iTunes U, just the tremendous amount of the wealth of resources that are available. I mean, that's never been available before. And as students begin to understand that the teacher in the classroom is no longer the sole source of instruction, the sole source of education, I think students are going to they're going to catch a stronger passion for learning. Michael Wesch, who is the Wired professor, professor of cultural anthropology, asks his kids at the beginning, of course these are university students, he asks them, how many of you hate school? Vast majority of them raise their hands. And then he asks, how many of you hate learning? And of course no hands are raised. Mm-hmm. So we naturally inherently have a desire and a love for learning, and school has the tendency to beat that out of us. So once kids begin to catch the spark that they can continue to learn on their own, self-directed, sort of an inherent level of where there's a strong expectancy for greater value and will lead to greater motivation, I think we're going to see kids learning on their own.
And it's not just children, it's all of us. We've all learned from the web. We've also all have been burned by issues related to the validity of what we've read on the web. There are some concerns when it comes to using technology in the classroom. Could you talk about that for a minute or two?
So I guess there are probably 2 concerns that seem to surface fairly regularly. One is you have a lot of teachers that say, what I've been doing for 15 years has worked. Where the definition of worked is my kids are scoring well on standardized tests. As long as we continue this incredible push towards increased standardized tests, and of course here in South Carolina, we just recently got the news that schools and kids are doing fairly well, but of course it's a moving target. As the benchmark for AYP increases, there's only so far kids can go. Dan Willingham, a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Virginia, makes the argument that specifically leveraged towards merit pay, but it works here as well, that going from a 70 to a 75 is a much different number than going from a 90 to a 95.
Yes.
And our legislators, unfortunately, don't really understand that. So we are a fairly high-performing school, and we made AYP this year. I can almost guarantee we won't next year, and that's not because we've decreased in quality. That's because the benchmark itself has increased. But at some point, there's a ceiling effect where you just can't go any further. So you have teachers that, what I've been doing for 15 years has worked, where the definition of worked is my kids are scoring well on standardized tests, and they don't see any reason to bring the technology use into the classroom, because in conjunction with all of this new technology should come an underlying pedagogical shift. Even when we get into higher education, right, there should come an underlying andragogical shift, right?
Absolutely.
So the teachers don't want that. So that's problem one. Problem two is teacher education programs are not preparing teachers, they're not preparing pre-service teachers for the emerging pedagogies that are going to be important for the next 25 to 30 years of education with all of these new technologies. Problem three, there are strong influences of incorrect pedagogies. So lots of folks will immediately argue for radical constructivism. They'll say that very a la Papert and Logo machines and Mindstorm and so on, and they'll say that no, we just give the kids the stuff and let them figure it out. Well, of course, we've seen in the last week or so that our so-called digital natives, and I don't agree with the native immigrant distinction at all, but for the sake of this conversation, our so-called digital native kids, they know certain things. They know their Facebook, they know their texting. But in terms of leveraging, these tools for learning purposes, they don't know how to determine whether. So a popular example is when you search for Martin Luther King in Google, one of the top results a couple of years ago was actually a site run by the White Liberation Front, which is, and it had very, racist, but it was subtle in that it was trying to convince kids that Martin Luther King wasn't the hero that we know that he was.
Right.
Well, kids, if we don't teach them this sort of this sort of web-based literacy, they don't know how to determine, they don't know how to go to a who is site and determine whether a site was, who made it, where it's hosted, perhaps is that sketchy. They're not able to figure out the inherent biases of different sites. Is what you read on Fox News going to be the same, going to have the same level of credibility when they're talking about a Democrat versus a Republican? And the same could be said for when you're looking at something that's a little further on the left.
Right, and you make such an important point that what we're testing, though, isn't those higher order skills of thinking. Though we're testing your basic knowledge levels, and that's exactly where technology is strongest, and the skills that our students need the most are those ones of judgment and higher level thought. Could you talk a little bit about Google Tools?
Sure. So there are several tools that are a part of the Google suite that I think really will help to maximize student potential and teacher potential as well, especially in terms of productivity. In the Google Apps suite, and Google Apps for Education is free for schools.
Outstanding.
So instead of spending all of this money going with GroupWise and having to deal with all of this server maintenance and having to go through updates and antivirus scans and so on, schools can switch to Gmail, which is a part of the Google Apps for Education suite, and then you get Google Docs, which is collaborative document editing. You get Google Spreadsheets, which is collaborative spreadsheet editing. You get Google Forms, which does surveys. You get Blogger, which does blogging. You get all of these different Google tools that will help you. Google Calendar for school-wide calendars. You get all of this wonderful stuff that has a central administration interface that whoever is on the IT side of a school can, you make this available to this person. You can give students email addresses if you want to. It's very customizable and, again, entirely free. There are entire states that are switching to Google Apps for Education for all of their schools and saving bundles of dollars.
That's outstanding.